this video, we will be replacing the valve cover gaskets, spark plugs, intake manifold, thermostat, ignition coils, fuel injector O-rings, PCV valve, and drive belt in this 2001 Ford F150. Taking a look inside the engine, we are going to center our focus on the passenger side towards the front of the engine bay. Specifically, we will first want to locate the alternator, which is pretty centrally located. Right next to the alternator, we have our coolant crossover. We can see on this crossover component, there is a buildup of some type of material on the outside. This is a good indication that the gasket is failing at this connection point. And if we take a little closer look, we can see that our crossover component is mounted from the bottom, which means that we cannot access the screws to simply remove the gasket. Now, because this gasket is failing, there is a high probability that the plastic intake manifold connection point is also failing. Thus, we will need to replace the intake manifold. To begin, we're going to relieve the fuel system pressure. This is done through the passenger side door. This switch is located behind the passenger side kick panel. Behind this kick panel, we have the fuel inertia switch, or the fuel pump switch, that will allow us to shut off the fuel pressure. We can begin by prying up our lower trim piece. We can then pry away the passenger side kick panel. And behind that kick panel, we have our inertia switch. On the inertia switch wiring harness, we have a small black tab that is holding it in place. We need to very carefully pry back the retainer over that small black tab. We're then going to crank the engine for a few seconds, which will relieve the fuel pressure. After the fuel pressure has been relieved, we're going to disconnect the cable from the negative battery terminal. And I like to wrap these in a rag just to make sure that they don't accidentally move and touch that terminal again. Next, we want to drain the cooling system. This is done by going underneath on the front passenger side portion of the engine bay. Underneath, we are looking for the drain fitting, which is located in that lower corner of the radiator. You will want a bucket placed underneath the drain fitting as you loosen it. And this drain plug can be accessed from above. And you will want to remove the reservoir cap to let some air into the system so that coolant will flow. Just make sure your engine is cold when you remove the cap. Using a 1/2-inch ratchet on the idler pulley, we want to remove the drive belt. Next, we will be removing the accelerator control protection shield. This is held on with 3 10mm nuts. And then we can just lift that shield off. Next, we need to disconnect our intake air temperature sensor. Depressing the little tab and wiggling it will allow that to come off. After that, we need to locate our idle air control inlet hose as well as our PCV hose. Both of these will need to be removed, and we can remove those by gently pulling and wiggling those out. We have a worm clamp connecting our intake assembly to our throttle body. We can loosen that up and gently pull that unit off. Our air filter housing clamp can then come off. And we are still connected by our MAF sensor. And we can follow that mass airflow sensor wiring harness and disconnect that. And we should be able to pull that assembly out. On top, we can now easily access our upper radiator hose, and that upper radiator hose is going into our thermostat housing. To remove the thermostat housing, there are 3 bolts total, 1 on either side and 1 on the top. The 2 side bolts are 10 millimeters, and the one on top seems to be about 8 millimeter. And then we can remove that thermostat. And we'll stick a rag in just so debris doesn't fall down in there. To remove the accelerator cable from the throttle body, I will be using a very small screwdriver to work my way around the cable and loosen it up a little bit. Then I will grab onto the end of it with a needle nose pliers and work that the rest of the way out. My cruise control cable is next, and I can work that off of the throttle body. And then we can remove that return spring. Our cable bracket then has 2 10 millimeter bolts holding that on. I will remove the alternator next. There are 3 mounting bolts and 3 electrical connections to remove. 2 of the bolts are located towards the bottom and 1 bolt towards the top. There's a short bolt on the top, but it is 10 millimeters. Next, I'm going to remove the heater hose that is connected to our crossover. And we can push that out of the way. We have a connection point on the left side of our throttle body that we can pull off. We have a wiring harness connected to the right side of our throttle body. We can depress the tab and wiggle that off. I have 2 additional vacuum lines and an additional wiring harness to remove, located just to the right of the throttle body. On top of my EGR valve, I can remove that vacuum line as well. This will allow me to get some of this out of the way and another hose towards the back of the throttle body. At this point, I'm going to start loosening up some of the bolts around the throttle body. The hope is that I can get a little bit of play in it, which will help me determine what is still connected that we need to remove. On the left side here, we have two 8mm bolts, and this back one does not come all the way out because it is too tall, but we have it loose. On the back side of the throttle body, we have one 8mm bolt. And hiding behind that throttle body, we do have an additional 8mm bolt. Locating my EGR valve, I want to disconnect the valve to exhaust manifold pipe. This is a 1 1/4 inch nut. Now my throttle body is connected to the EGR valve. That is all connected to a bracket, and on my bracket I have at least one bolt holding it down. So we'll remove this 10mm bolt and see where that gets us. So at this point, our throttle body, EGR valve, and our bracket are all loose. We have a couple last connections on the far side that we need to remove. Now I'm going to mark these air lines before I remove them, just so I can remember how they go. So number 1 is on the left, number 2 will be on the right. And then I have this additional vacuum line that is red, and that is fed down under there, so I need to get that out of the way. And on the back side of that throttle body assembly, I have another wiring harness. And with that throttle body assembly removed off of the engine, we can see the location of the 4 bolts much easier. To identify some parts, we have our throttle body assembly. The throttle body assembly is connected to the EGR valve. The EGR valve has a vacuum solenoid, and that was one of our wiring harnesses with a couple vacuum lines underneath. On the other side, we have our DPFE, or differential pressure feedback sensor, for the EGR valve. And with that, we also had a wiring harness and a couple air lines. On the back side of the throttle body, we have the IAC valve, or idle air control valve. This also has a wiring harness. Mounted to the side of our throttle body, we have the throttle position sensor and the large tube going around the entire assembly is our air bypass valve inlet tube. Located next to our brake booster, we have a vapor management valve. This part is also known as the purge valve. I'm going to remove the vacuum line that is coming off the bottom of this, and that will allow me to get some of these lines out of the way. We will then locate our PCV valve and hose. Taking a look on the right portion of our engine, we want to find our fuel rail. That fuel rail is made of metal and runs the length of our intake manifold. If we continue to follow that fuel rail towards the firewall, there are two fuel retaining clips that need to be removed. We then want to remove each of our fuel lines that are connected to our fuel rail. To do this, I am using a fuel line disconnect tool and very carefully work that off. On the left side, we have two fuel rail mounting bolts, and on the right side we also have two fuel rail mounting bolts. We will be removing these four bolts with an 8mm wrench. And with those four bolts removed, our fuel rails are loose. And before we lift this out, we will disconnect each of the wiring harnesses that are connected to the fuel injectors. And then using a gentle rocking motion while we lift fuel rail, we can remove that assembly. And we will continue that same procedure for the driver's side portion on our fuel rail, taking off those wiring harnesses and then very gently working those fuel injectors out. And I have one bracket that's in the way for removing that fuel rail assembly. And then we'll see if we can get that fuel rail assembly out. Next we have our ignition coils. These have a wiring harness that we can remove and a 7mm bolt. To remove these, there is a small tab on the back side of them, which you can't see as they are installed. If we flip this over here, we have that small tab located right at the bottom. Now these front two spark plug holes are actually filled with coolant, which is another indication that our gasket or intake manifold has failed. And we will continue this for all of the coils. The intake manifold has 11 bolts. We are going to be loosening these bolts in quarter turn increments following the order specified by the repair manual. However, bolts 8 and 11 have actually already been removed when we took off the thermostat housing. So with the exception of those two, we will be following the prescribed sequential order. And at this point, all of our bolts have been removed. Those bolts that were holding the intake manifold down. We can lift the intake manifold off. And then we can stick some rags in those openings for right now. We can now shift our attention to the valve cover. We're going to take a look at the valve cover on the passenger side portion of the engine first. Using needle nose pliers, we can work off our hold down clips for our wiring harness. We do have a connection point near our oil filler tube. And we have a little hold down on the back side of it. And in each of the stud locations, I'm going to be applying some Amsoil metal protector. And we're going to let that soak in for a while. And using a 6.5/16 socket or box end wrench, we can loosen those bolts. On this particular model of vehicle, the valve cover bolts do not actually come all the way out. They will loosen up until they just continually spin, and they should wiggle in their spot. I went ahead and removed the passenger side front wheel as well as the wheel well shroud to give me access inside the engine. And this does give us much better access to those remaining valve cover bolts. And once all of those valve cover bolts are loose, we can gently work out the valve cover. On our valve cover, we will want to remove the gasket. Prior to installing the new gasket, I will be cleaning off the valve cover with Amsoil engine degreaser. After cleaning that up, it's looking pretty good. We can flip it over and take a look at the inside. Now, per the repair manual, the valve cover gasket should be mated to the valve covers with gasket adhesive before the valve covers are installed. And we want to make sure that that gasket is pushed all the way into the groove of that valve cover. After applying my gasket maker and working that gasket in, I'm going to go ahead and flip this over and add a little weight to it. This will help that gasket remain seated while I prep the engine for reinstallation. To prep the engine, I'm going to very carefully scrape any of the remaining gasket material, and then we'll come back with some acetone and clean off the mating surface. And then if any debris has fallen into the valve area, we want to make sure we either vacuum or blow that out. To prep the bolts to go back in, I'm going to replace all of the grommets. Our valve cover bolts we can then push through just a little bit to seat them in the new gasket. And from that underside, we will want to work that flange around our bolt. Now, I did make the mistake of not writing down where the long bolts and the short bolts go. As best as I could research online, this was the sequence: long, long, short, long, long, short. And our other side, starting from the front, long, long, short, 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 short. Now we also have two areas that we need to install extra RTV sealant before we reinstall this in the engine. Now, once we put that RTV sealant on, we want to install it within 5 minutes of applying that sealant. We then need to tighten them in 2 steps, ending with a range between 71 and 106 inch-pounds. We're going to do the first round of tightening. We're going to wait 2 minutes, and then we're going to do the second round of tightening. Now the sequence we're going to do is starting in the middle. We're going to go across, working our way to the ends. I'm going to start by just very lightly snugging them down as my first round. I'll come back and then go to probably about 50 inch-pounds, and then follow up between 71 and 106 inch-pounds. Now, after torquing all of those valve cover bolts down to the correct specification, everything is looking pretty good. I did go ahead and replace the wheel well shroud as well as the passenger side front wheel. And then to begin prepping for my driver side valve cover, I removed the wheel well shroud as well as the wheel. The process for the driver side valve cover is the same as we did for the passenger. We will make sure that we note the bolt locations as far as which ones are the long ones versus the short ones. And by going through that wheel well, we can gain better access. A little Amsoil metal protector on all of those bolts will help those come out. We can also work that wiring harness out of the way. And using our 5/16 wrench, we can work those loose. Back towards the firewall, we do have one bolt that is located somewhat behind the EGR tube. This one is the most difficult one for me to get to. Additionally, there were 2 bolts located behind the power steering pump reservoir bracket. By using a swivel on a socket, I was able to get in there and loosen those bolts. And with all of those valve cover bolts loose, we can gently work off the valve cover and remove that from the engine. Now, I did remember to make note of my bolt locations. I have short, long, long, short, long, long on my first side. If I flip that around, I have long, short, 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 short. And we can see those 2 short bolts that were located behind that power steering pump bracket. And if we flip that valve cover over, we can remove the old gasket and get everything cleaned up with Amsoil's engine degreaser. And we can prep our new bolts by replacing that grommet and cleaning whatever debris off if necessary. After getting that valve cover all cleaned up, we're looking pretty good. We can go ahead and flip that over, and we can add our sealant. And then we can work that new gasket into the groove. And we want to make sure that is seated fully in the groove. And a little bit of weight will help hold that in place while that sealant sets up. We can then turn our focus back to the engine and prep our mating surface. Very carefully, we can scrape the existing gasket material and come back and clean that mating surface up with some acetone. After we got that mating surface all cleaned, everything's looking pretty good. If any debris fell down in there, we want to make sure and remove that either with compressed air or a vacuum or wiping it out. We can then install our bolts into the gasket. And again, we want to work that small gasket flange into our bolt so that it will hold that bolt in place in preparation for reinstallation. Then we need a couple extra dabs of sealant. Now again, once this sealant goes on, we have 5 minutes to install this on the vehicle. So we're going to work this back onto the engine. And I'm going to start by hand tightening all of these bolts first. Again, working in sequence from the middle towards the outside. We will then torque these bolts in sequence between 71 and 106 inch-pounds. With both of our valve covers installed and the bolts torqued, we're going to move on to the spark plug replacement procedure. Prior to removing the spark plugs, I'm going to shoot some compressed air down each of the hole locations. I don't want to have debris in there and remove the spark plug and have that debris fall into the cylinder. And then using a spark plug socket, I can remove those. The spark plug gap needs to be 0.045 for our new spark plugs. If we take a look at our old spark plug, we're sitting at about 0.060. Obviously there has been some movement over the last 160,000 miles. And prior to installing that, we will put a little bit of antifreeze on it. To install our new spark plug, we want to first install it by hand to make sure that we don't cross thread it. Each of those spark plugs will then get torqued to a range between 84 and 168 inch-pounds for this model of vehicle. And then I'm going to stuff a rag down in there so no debris gets in there as I continue. At this point, we want to remove the old gasket and clean all mating surfaces. You want to be very careful that you do not damage the mating surface, otherwise the new unit will have difficulty sealing. I'm going to then come back with some acetone and clean off any remaining debris. Everything is looking pretty good on my passenger side. I'm going to repeat the same procedure with the driver's side. And that driver's side turned out pretty good as well. Taking a look at our old unit compared to our new unit, there's obviously a height difference with the new unit. What we're concerned with is the location of all of the holes, that they will line up with the existing engine. Everything looks pretty good. We want to transfer over any components from our old unit to our new one. If we flip this unit over, we can see that it has an integrated gasket system. This design does not require any additional intake gaskets. They are already installed. At this point, I'm going to remove all of the rags and set my new intake manifold in place. We'll put just a little bit of anti-seize on the bolts and then install them finger tight. After installing all of the bolts finger tight, we're going to torque these down in sequence. Now, according to the manufacturer, we want to start with 18 inch-pounds on each bolt, followed by 18 foot-pounds on each bolt. Our bolts 11 and 8 go to our thermostat, so we're going to go ahead and install that also at this time so that we can truly follow the sequence specified. According to the manufacturer, we want to torque these bolts in sequence. In stage 1, we will tighten it to 18 inch-pounds, and stage 2, we will tighten it to 18 foot-pounds. And after torquing all of those bolts, we're looking pretty good, and we can progress through the reassembly. Our wiring harness can go back on those studs. Reconnect that wiring harness up front. We have our old ignition coils, but since we are going through and replacing a bunch of parts, I went ahead and purchased a new set of coils. Now, all of these plugs are identical in their orientation. We do want to install a little bit of dielectric grease to our connection point between the spark plug and the coil. And we do want this to be angled so that we can connect up with our wiring harness. As well as our hold down screw. And with that coil fully seated, we can install our hold down screw. Now, this needs to be tightened between 2.7 and 3.3 Newton meters. First, I'm going to go just hand tight, and then I'm going to come back and torque it down. And we can plug in that coil. This process will be continued for each coil. Installation of our fuel rail assembly comes next. However, we are first going to prep our fuel injectors prior to putting this assembly in. We're first going to work out one of the fuel injectors. I'm then going to gently wipe it down just to get a little bit of the debris off. And then we have 2 rubber O-rings that we will be replacing. And we have our new rubber rings to replace those. But prior to replacing those, I'm going to use a little Amsoil metal protector to help clean off the injector. I can then install my 2 new O-rings. And I'm going to finish it up by putting just a little bit of silicone paste on those O-rings before reinstalling it back on my fuel rail. That fuel rail can then be reinstalled into the vehicle, and each of those injectors seated in place. We have our brake booster hose bracket to install. I'm going to leave this loose right now so I have a little bit of play. Each injector will then have a wiring harness. Next we can add our fuel rail mounting bolts. And then we can reconnect those fuel lines. The PCV valve and hose is next. I went ahead and purchased a new PCV valve, again, since we are switching out so many parts. This hose connects to the back of the intake manifold and then comes around the side and fits into the valve cover. We'll set that throttle body assembly in place. Now we do have a wiring harness on the back side of that throttle body before we get that situated. I can then roughly position all my vacuum lines in place. I have a red line that connects up behind my EGR valve tube. And then my number 1 and number 2 hoses, followed by the wiring harness. This is to the right of the throttle body. And before I attach my throttle body, I'm going to connect my hose to the back of it. This is the one that runs from the brake booster. And then I'll tighten up that mounting bracket. This was the one that I previously left a little bit loose so I could have that play in the line so I could connect it. And then I'm going to add my 4 bolts for the throttle body and start those by hand. And 1 additional bolt on our mount. Next we can connect our EGR tube with the EGR tube nut. And then we can connect our lines up on the left side of our throttle body. Another vacuum line on top of our EGR valve. And 2 more vacuum lines. And 2 more wiring harnesses. And another hose towards the top back of the throttle body. We can then connect our heater hose to our left crossover. And install that clamp. Next comes the alternator. And tighten down those 3 bolts. And we then have our 3 electrical connectors for our alternator. We can then position our mount for our throttle body cables. We can then install our return spring and our cables. On my thermostat housing, I can remove that 1 bolt Bring my power steering pump back and reinstall my bolt. Next, we can replace our upper radiator hose and position both of the clamps into place. We can then add our air housing assembly, making sure to reconnect our mass airflow sensor and clamp that back together. Reconnect up to our throttle body. We can then connect our PCV hose as well as our idle air control inlet hose, and then our air temperature sensor. After that, we have our accelerator control protection shield that has 3 10mm bolts and an additional vacuum line. So at this point, we basically have everything back together. There are a couple things I'm going to do before we are ready to start this engine. If you remember, we previously drained the cooling system, but then we went ahead and opened up the cooling system and exposed all of those components. So I'm going to do a cooling system flush just to clean everything out before I fill the system back up. And with my cooling system flushed, I can add my coolant. I went ahead and replaced the fuel filter underneath the truck, as our fuel pressure has already been relieved and it's been a while since this has been replaced. I'm going to reconnect my inertia switch inside the passenger side portion of the vehicle and reinstall the cable onto the negative battery terminal. And we'll do one last visual inspection just to make sure that everything is connected and we didn't leave off any components that we may have forgot about. Everything's looking pretty good, so I think we are ready to start it up. Now, it may take just a bit to crank since we did essentially drain all the fuel lines, especially with replacing that fuel filter. I'm going to let the engine run until it warms up. I have the coolant reservoir cap removed. As the air is being expelled from the cooling system, I will add a little bit more coolant to compensate for that reduction in volume as it gets pumped through the system. Everything seems to be operating as it should. So I'm going to go ahead and replace the trim pieces on my passenger side portion. Now, the last thing I'm going to do before I take this for a test drive, I am going to do an oil change. Because we exposed the valve covers, we essentially are exposing the lubrication system. If any type of debris were to have got in there, I want to make sure to get that out of the system before I go drive this around. And after completing the oil change, everything looks and sounds great, so we can take it for a test drive. Taking a close look at our serpentine belt, it is not in horrible shape. Small cracks like this are very common. If you have chunks missing, you want to make sure you replace the belt. This one, though, was not in horrible shape. I could have kept running it for a while, but I went ahead and replaced it. My driver's side valve cover gasket seems to be in pretty decent shape. I did not see any clear areas of failure. However, on my passenger side valve cover gasket, upon close inspection, I do see quite a few areas where there is cracking. So it was good that we went ahead and replaced this. Our intake manifold gaskets seem like they're in pretty decent condition overall. There are a couple areas that look like they may be starting to separate. And then on the one side we do have some deformation of the gasket material itself, so there's a good chance that this was failing or going to fail within short time. So it was good that we replaced this. Taking a look at my spark plugs from the front of the engine towards the back. We have the driver's side on the right, the passenger side on the left. Our ranges for the old spark plugs were about 0.060 up through 0.067. If you remember, the manufacturer specifies new spark plugs to be 0.045. So after 162,000 miles, we can see that our gap has increased pretty substantially. If we take a look at our common spark plug conditions chart and we compare that to one of our spark plugs out of the engine, I would say that if I had to categorize this, it would fall most closely with the worn spark plug. And if we read about that, it does say that the plugs have been left in the engine too long, and given that these plugs were in the engine for 162,000 miles, they have probably been left in the engine too long. And lastly, we will take a look at that front crossover, which is the whole reason why we started this repair to begin with. Our passenger side has 3 bolts that is holding this together. And our driver's side also has 3 bolts holding this together. If I take a look inside our coolant port, it looks like there's damage to the sidewall. We'll take a closer look when we take this apart. And then we can work that crossover off of there. On my driver's side, I can work that gasket out of there. And the gasket itself actually seems to be in decent condition. One of the things I have read is that the plastic becomes weak and can get brittle. This seems like it's in decent condition. Again, this is my driver's side, and this side we did not have any leaks on. On my passenger side, which is the side that was leaking, we're going to see if we can work that gasket out. And now the gasket itself, we do have a little tear in it. If we test that plastic from the passenger side, which was the side that was leaking, we can see that there are a couple areas where it is cracked. And since the plastic on the intake manifold is cracked, just having replaced the gasket would not have solved this problem, so it was good that we did this repair.